So welcome, everybody. This is our second installment of a harvest update to give you the insider scoop on what went down during Harvest 2023. The last time we spoke was in September. We're excited to have some wonderful vintners, a couple new faces from our last Harvest Zoom to give us all the scoop on the 2023 harvest in the Santa Lucia Highlands and beyond. So I'd like to have my panel introduce themselves. And Allison, let's start with you.
Hey everyone, thanks for being here today. My name is Allison Frichtel-Hollister. I am the winemaker at Walt Wines and making Pinot and Chardonnay, and I'm excited to be here.
Good afternoon. My name is Cami Knudsen. I'm the winemaker at Talbot Vineyards, and we do all estate Chardonnay and Pinot Noir.
And I'm Sabrine Rodoms. I'm the winemaker at Wrath Wines. I also have my own brand called Scratch, and I consult for some other people. I've had the luxury of purchasing fruit off the Santa Lucia Highlands bench for the last 15 to 20 years. Oh God, it's been a long time. But we still love it, and we love the variety we get. And we'll chat a little bit about the difference between SLH and the other properties we source from in the Monterey AVA.
And hello, my name is Nick Francioni. I am one of the Francioni family members at Roar Wines, and I work mostly in wine production and kind of generally running the business with my brother and my dad under the great reign of Gary Francioni, and that's about me.
And I'm Adam Lee. I'm the owner of Clarice Wine Company. I was the founder of Siduri Wines. I make wines for Clarice in the Santa Lucia Highlands. I also consult with Rombauer Wines on their Pinot Noir program in the Santa Lucia Highlands. And I'm fortunate enough to have known the Francionis for a long time and help them a little bit in blending the Pinot Noir for Roar Wines as well.
Wonderful. Thank you all for being here. We're so excited to hear how everything's been for the last couple of months since we spoke in September. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. I want to encourage all of you joining us here to put your questions into the chat. Our winemakers will be monitoring and watching the chat, responding to you. We'll call out some questions at the end, and also after each of our panelists has a chance to fill us in on their harvest experience, we can invite some questions. Meanwhile, I hope that you'll also keep yourself on mute so that we don't interrupt a speaker or have background noise. We are recording. We'll send out a link to this recording in case you miss anything, and make sure we add it to our Santa Lucia Highlands events page. And with that, Nick, I would love it if you would kind of start just to give another review of the growing season overall, and then, you know, tell us what's been happening both in the vineyards and at the Roar Winery.
Certainly. So we had last winter of 2022 and 23. It was really rainy year, which was great and exciting for everyone in California. Although, of course, there were those great floods that caused havoc. And nonetheless, that rain was great for the vineyards. And it was a bit of a cooler spring as well. So we did have a late start as far as bud break got going. So everything kind of lagged as far as the stages of viticulture went. And so we knew it was going to be a late year coming in. And really even the maturity of the grapes was quite slow. And I think during the last harvest update that you guys had, everybody was twiddling their thumbs, wondering when that first pick was going to come about. And it was slow. And then suddenly it was fast, of course. You never really know what to expect when it comes to a grape harvest. You can only plan for so much before everything changes in a moment. But nonetheless, we got started on our end picking. Our very first pick was September 29th, but that was kind of an earlier pick for us. Sorry, I'm getting a little feedback. But on October 4th was really when things got started, and we had about 2 weeks of pretty intense. When can you fix that? Gerald, do you mind, or is it only me that has the feedback?
I've got it too.
Okay, cool. All right, awesome. I can focus now. Okay, so September 29th was when the very first pick happened, but that was kind of really on the earlier side. And then October 4th was when really just everything went running. There was about 14 days of just nonstop action, bringing in fruit every day. So it was really a mad rush when it got to that. There was some elevated temperatures, which really pushed things along. And one thing that we noticed throughout the growing season was that normally we have certain vineyards that kind of lag behind and ripen a little bit later, but that really wasn't the case this year. Everything was just all ready at once, which is not really ideal when it comes to winery ops. Ideally, you have some spacing between all of your different harvest picks, but everything was just kind of all ready all at once, and that's just the way that it was. Even some of the particular clone 23, it's always later. It just takes longer to develop and mature. That one was at the very beginning. So it was just very odd the way that things had kind of come together. Of course, it was very late. So, there was a lot of hang time, a lot of grapes on the vine for extended time in comparison to previous vintages. Our Chardonnay came later as well, which was a little bit odd. Usually it's kind of all in the middle of the time frame for picking, but that was really at the end for us. Most of our Chardonnay was harvested after our Pinot. And then Syrah wasn't harvested until sometime in November, the early part of November. So for us, we just finally put that into barrel just the other day. And so it was late, and that's the way that it goes sometimes. Something my dad mentioned was that we'd never really go into November with Syrah. And there's only ever been 2 other vintages in his 25 years that have done that, which was 2002 and 2011. So there's only three vintages now in 25 years where we've had such a late harvest. And that's really cool and significant and something that is exciting to share. As far as the wine quality goes, I think a little bit more time will tell, but in general, the fruit quality was really, really good coming in. Acid levels were probably a little bit higher than normal. And there was one little funny story during harvest. Before we get into harvest, we always do a team meeting where we plan everything out and kind of just get on the same page as far as expectations. What are we looking for? What do we expect going into harvest? And so my dad kind of made his little predictions and everything. And as we were in harvest, in the middle of harvest, everything, like I said, was just very compact. All of the fruit was ready, and we were picking on a Sunday. So we picked for 13 straight days because of a Sunday that we picked. And as we were kind of getting ready to make that decision, my dad called me and he says, I don't know if you remember that during this time when I was telling you guys that this was going to happen and we were probably going to have to pick on a Sunday. I don't know if you remember when I was telling you about that. Just really, drilling it into me. And just all I could do was with a straight face, no, I don't remember that. And just let him not take all of that big win out of that prediction. But he was right, so I can't completely knock him. But it was crazy in that sense, that it was just every single day, even on a Sunday, bringing in fruit. And although that picking time was so crazy with that condensed time frame, it was so, everything was happening so quickly as far as bringing in fruit that a lot of the fermentations really hadn't quite got going too intensely. So we weren't doing a whole lot of the winemaking part of the actual fermentation and twice a day punch downs. So it wasn't really quite as crazy in some ways, but it was just madness as far as bringing in fruit. So that's more or less my little spiel of the harvest update.
I think I'll jump in right after you there, Nick, because I couldn't agree more with what you said. There was a lot of hurry up and wait, and then hurry up and get it all in. So we started at Talbot, the latest we've ever started. We started picking Sleepy Hollow on October 2nd. We thought we would have a lag because it took us a really long time to get to that first pick call. And 4 days passed, the temperature decided that, finally it was ready to get going and become harvest. And we were finished picking the vineyard by the 27th of October. So we really brought in our entire harvest in 3 weeks. And what does that mean when you're in a small winery? Well, we filled every tank. We had to pause picking so that we could get tanks cleaned out. But if you drove by Talbot, you may have seen us gathered out in the parking lot because we were so full, we kept setting off our CO2 alarms. We were overpowering our CO2 evacuation in the winery. And so the alarms would go off and we'd open all the doors and everybody would go out to the parking lot and we'd wait out there for a few minutes. Thanks, Gwen. That's a picture of us just kind of waiting for everything to clear off. So, we had to kind of stagger how we were doing punch downs and how we were then digging tanks, because if we dug tanks and did punch downs at the same time, we learned that we could not use our fans in the winery. So that was kind of an interesting little story of just how rapidly things came in and how fast we were churning through them in the winery. But with that late start to harvest, we actually had some pretty cool events that came out of it. We hosted a harvest apprenticeship program at Talbot this year over 2 weeks. We brought in 2 very big groups of people that came in. They were there to pick grapes, and we had to unfortunately tell them there was nothing to pick yet. But we, quickly shifted gears. We did blending seminars and tours, and we got everybody out into the vineyard to actually do our sugar sampling for us. So I think when you might have one of me kneeling down on the ground, we were checking the bricks levels in quite a few of our blocks out there. So it was really fun to bring in some of our consumers, show them around the Sleepy Hollow property, and really involve them in some of the pre-harvest activities. They really got into it and started placing bets over who picked the bucket with the highest sugar, and did they win something? Would that start harvest? So we really had a great time. And then because we finished so quickly, some of the other wineries in the area were also in this situation of every tank is full. So we got to bring in some other fruit from other places, which was really fun to work with and get to help your neighbors and kind of share tank space. So finally, all said and done, we finished bringing in the last fruit on November 10th. We threw ourselves a little end of harvest party, had cake and candles. No lighter though, so brought out a torch and got all of the candles started that way. And then really fortunate to host the SLH end of harvest luncheon. So a lot of the winemakers here on the line with me attended that, and it was just a really nice way to wrap up kind of a hectic year and get together and share some good bottles of wine and talk about everything that occurred over the vintage. So same boat as Nick, kind of really waiting for some ferments to finish up to see overall quality. But so far what I've tasted, the wines are looking very pretty, even though they hung out there much longer than they normally would have.
Cami, thank you so much. Maybe Cami, you and Nick can talk a little bit specifically about Chardonnay versus Pinot Noir this year. What are you seeing? How do you maybe compare it to some of the most recent vintages? What would you say?
Well, it is a very, very strange feeling as a Chardonnay and Pinot Noir winemaker to see everyone picking Cabernet and Merlot before you were even starting to pick Chardonnay. So I was starting to think like maybe my taste buds were off, but I would say the quality level of everything I was tasting was very good. Acid levels were a bit higher just because of the long growing season. They didn't really kick into gear. But I'm seeing much higher conversion rates this year. So much higher alcohol potential than I have in years past, which was just kind of an interesting thing for me to see. But yeah, really started picking a lot more of the Pinot Noir before we started picking Chardonnay. So I picked a few blocks of Chardonnay that come in earlier. Then we really moved in and kind of got all of the Pinot Noir off of Sleepy Hollow and then back to Chardonnay for some of those richer styles. But really, the fruit, I think, did really well. I think it's the winemakers that suffered more this year. I don't tend to see us as a very patient group of people, and this harvest really tasked our patience of just, wait and we'll get there and the fruit will be delicious. And there's nothing you can do to hurry our little grapes along. We're going to be ready when we're ready, but it was a fun harvest.
Yeah, for us, the Chardonnay was just a little bit slower. I mean, the sugar loading was slower. I think there was less dehydration in the Chardonnay as well, so they just held on a little bit longer. And yeah, it really didn't come along until much later, beyond when we'd finished picking all of our Pinot. And as I mentioned, it's normally kind of right in the middle of the harvest window, but for whatever reason, sometimes some things are explicable when it comes to grapes, and maybe you figure it out later, but in the moment you're kind of scratching your head wondering why. But you kind of just play along with whatever Mother Nature's giving you in that moment, and certainly pray and hope that it's going to get there. Surely it did. It just took a little bit longer this year.
Sounds exciting. I can't wait to taste some of these 2023 wines. Let's see. I think we'd love to hear from Adam next. Adam, why don't you give us some of your harvest experience? Let us know what's been happening out there for you guys.
Sure. So I'll talk a little bit about Clarice and also about Rombauer, because Rombauer certainly gets fruit from Escole at the middle to northern end of the SLH all the way down past Sierra Mar. So we're kind of spread out, while Clarice is a little more, Rosella's and Gary's a little closer together. First off, I would say, yeah, this is, I think, the latest year. In fact, I'm sure the latest year that I've ever had. With Siduri, I started in the Santa Lucia Highlands in 2017, or I'm sorry, 1997. I get these all confused. And 1999 up until this point was the latest year, where I didn't start picking until early October. And now this year it was like October 5th. It was quite late. Having said that, I think it's kind of different than 1999 was. As Nick mentioned, it started later and it finished later. And so it's almost like the entire season shifted, while in a year like 1999, it just never really warmed up. And consequently, it stayed very cool throughout. And I think the hang time was a little bit longer. So I adjusted with Clarice. At least I use a lot of whole cluster, and in this year I used a good amount, still a lot, but I didn't go incredibly heavy on it because I didn't think it had this long, a longer than normal hang time. It just kind of had a long hang time, as the SLH always does, but it pushed it back a little bit later in the season. One thing that always happens is my birthday is September 12th, and this is the 5th year out of 30 that I've made Pinot Noir that I've actually been able to go out and truly celebrate my birthday. But then November was kind of screwed. So, it's kind of how it works as far as harvest goes. With the Rombauer stuff, I think there is something really fascinating to look at there. So the southern end of the Santa Lucia Highlands, so you take kind of the middle part, or there's a school right along River Road for those of you who've ever been there. And if you go south from there, kind of where the southern part is, that area is always cooler in the winter. It's further away from the ocean. And it is running behind throughout the season, and then it catches up because as the summer goes along, it's further away from the ocean, so you have less fog, and it warms up more, and it ends up catching up at some point and then moving ahead. That really wasn't the case this year. To me, the southern end actually still ripened later. It never quite fully caught up to the northern end of the SLH. And so it makes it, in my experience, a pretty unique vintage to have the south hang longer, the further away from the ocean, to hang longer and pick later than the north did. And that's very unusual for the area. As it stands right now, and I tell people this frequently from all sorts of areas, be it Russian River or Oregon or wherever, I can tell right off when it's a crappy year, and this is not a crappy year. But the difference between very, very good and great sometimes takes a little bit of time. And because we are still barely in November, and a lot of these grapes didn't really even go down to barrel at some point in time until early November, I'm 100% positive it's a very, very good year. Is it a great year? I think time's going to tell through just the natural evolution, the élevage of the wines, but also through some of our blending, because it is different between the North and the South, and pulling these different pieces together is going to be fascinating.
I think that's a great point or topic. Many people always ask me, is like, how great is the vintage? And it's, you've just finished a ferment and you taste something that is crazy high in acid, and like, certainly you can tell fruit quality is very good. But for you, what do you think are the certain markers that you finally realize that a vintage really truly is very, very special? Is there a certain point where you can finally declare that? Is it after bottle, before bottle? Like, when do you really feel good about something?
Yeah, I mean, I worry about things all the time, but there is the point where in the blending process, you can look. So one of the great things about the SLH is the quality, even in the more challenging years that we've had over all of us over the years, the quality by and large is still more often than not very good. Sometimes you have to work to blend things together to take it to the next level, and have to be a little stricter in those blends. But I think it's still possible to do that. I really think that it's at that blending process that you get the first hint. I mean, well, maybe the second hint. The first hint is in the ferment. You can look at it and you can like, okay, it's past the first hurdle of just being a really good ferment. It's got good color. It smells good. Didn't really have to muck around with it a lot. All of that stuff is key. And then now you're kind of at that awkward stage where things are either going through mel or aren't quite, and it's kind of like having a 15-year-old hanging around the house. I'm like, oh my God, what did I do? How are they going to turn out? I kind of messed that up as a parent. I don't know. And then there are other times it's like, oh my gosh, they're such a wonderful kid. And it's the same thing with the wines. I think once we're done with ML, once things are sulfured, and once we start to do some tasting and some blending, for me at least, that's where I'm like, okay, this is a great or very good year. But I think truly great takes a little bit of time after bottling to get to that. I also think there's a great, and I would love actually all the winemakers' opinions on this. There's this debate about what makes a great vintage or not. In Bordeaux, guess what? Chateau Margaux made a great wine that year. Is that a great year? Well, no, Chateau Margaux makes a great wine every single year. So, is that great? But if everybody made an exceptionally good wine, that to me seems like a great year. So I wonder if that's maybe a better judge of what makes a great vintage or not.
I would say I'm finding it would be pretty hard to like mess up the 2023 so far. Like it's been a super strong vintage for those reasons you said. Like the grapes looked healthy. They weren't stressed from drought. They weren't shriveled. They didn't have an extra kind of microbial challenge to get through. So those fermentations were just beautiful, super healthy, great color, fast fermentations. We're pretty happy so far.
I also think that we're really, really lucky where we are. We just don't have the pressure, the weather pressure. I think that, when a lot of the indicators of a great vintage in Europe was based on weather initially. And I think, we're in a space that we just don't get that much pressure from rainfall and mildew. We get a lot of wind. I think we're super lucky. I think we're a little, I always feel a little slightly lazy as a winemaker because we just don't have it that hard. I think 2009, we had that storm from Mexico that came up that was very humid and very muggy. But I just can't think of, and then we've had a couple times where we've had a Labor Day heat wave, and then the following weekend had a heat wave. But to be honest, I think we're pretty spoiled as winemakers in our region where we are.
Do you think, Sabrina, and I don't know the answer to this because I don't make Chardonnay, and the Chardonnays I've made in my life have been pretty mediocre. So I'm not a really good Chardonnay maker, but I think Chardonnay can be more challenged given the cooling effect of the winds and fog in the SLH with botrytis and things like that. Sometimes than Pinot can be. Is that fair for any of y'all who do it? I mean, Cami, you're really involved in that.
Oh, I was just gonna say the one thing in '09 I remember is sour rot in the Chardonnay, because we sort of saw a little bit of sour rot in the Chardonnay, and we shook the plant and we ate the fruit, and it tastes like dirt, which is basically what sour rot is. It's a streptomyces component. But the problem is then you have to hedge your bet. So then we picked half, even though I wanted to wait another week. We picked half before the storm and half after, and I do think that's true, but still, I still think overall, like, we don't get hail, I mean, there's a lot of things we could be getting that we don't get. Anyway, go ahead, Cami.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, it is, it's always something we're watching out for, is like this disease pressure. Are we seeing mildew? Chardonnay is more susceptible to it, but also these long, cool growing seasons, and especially in Santa Lucia Highlands, is what makes our Chardonnays so extra special. That we can preserve that acidity, that we can get this really long time to develop really great, intricate flavors. So with all of the good, you're going to have a little bit of the bad to deal with sometimes. And I think that's just part of the excitement of being a cool climate, a Chardonnay and Pinot Noir winemaker. So it's really about, having great partnerships with your vineyard teams, keeping your eyes on the fruit, and just making sure that we can kind of nurture it all the way into the winery. But this was a higher pressure year just because it was a longer time to watch after the fruit too. And it was just such a cool spring.
And cool and pretty wet spring. I mean, it kept going for a while with the rain, which is great. I mean, the vines, health of the vines needed it, but that, I think, does create more challenges, right?
Yeah. I mean, I will say I was in New Zealand for the spring, so I was keeping track of it virtually. I was doing a vintage over in New Zealand, which they also had a very wet year. So yeah, it was a very long, cool, wet spring, which also just delayed some of the farming practices. We couldn't get tractors into the vineyard, either because we had a little bit of flooding or because the ground was just still so wet. But we made it through. And that's kind of the thing to always remember, is we're always going to get to the end, and we're always going to have something to make wine out of. And some years you just have to be a bit more of a winemaker than you were the year before.
Not to jump into a question right off, but Randy Peterman asked a question online here about, like, after you bottle the wine, I know that wine sometimes shut down right off and all of that. How, for all of y'all, how quickly do you know that you got really something special, that you've captured it in bottle? How soon can you tell that for all of y'all?
Yeah, I tend to think that the really superior wines are always showing very, very well. It's rare that you see kind of the superstars be quiet or muted or off or whatever. You kind of just get like a purity out of those really great wines that never really shows flaw. And certainly they can develop and get better and better and better. But they're, to me, the superstars that I've seen out of our wines tend to always show something really, really great and pure. I think is really the key thing that I see out of the great wines.
Yeah, I would say for the wines that have really knocked my socks off, we know before bottling, it's really kind of that March, April timeframe where we finished up ML, our secondary fermentation, and they've had some time to kind of rest, and we'll go back for that monthly tasting. And you have that moment of, oh, wow, like, I knew this was great. It's been tasting great all through ferment. It was tasting great all through ML, but now it kind of rested and it came into itself, and you have that moment of a wine just really like popping, and you get excited of like, wow, the next few months of this wine are going to be really exciting to watch as we prepare it for bottle. So I usually know beforehand that it's really going to be something I want to grab a couple extra cases of for my personal cellar, because it's going to be a great vintage. There was another question, maybe just quickly for some of the other winemakers on, was how do you deal with higher acidity?
waiting usually helps. Just giving it more time on the vine, letting the acidity naturally reduce is probably the most ideal. And then you don't have to adjust it in the cellar in any way. Lowering acidity when it's made wine is not really ideal, I would say. But giving it more hang time so long as the conditions permit is the best way to deal with high acid.
The nice thing too is, at Rath, we use a lot of stem inclusion. I know Adam does too, where we put the stems in, and stems have a lot of potassium in them. I know this year, Tondre Vineyard, we picked some fruit from there, and we were planning on not putting stems in because we're trying to bring the pH down because it tends to creep up even with the stem inclusion. Because that potassium really binds to acid and it precipitates out of the wine and you lose a lot of acidity. But this year we just went ahead and put it in because this is the one year where we were like, okay, let's not put any stems in Tondre because it's going to be too hot, too low in acid. But it came in screaming. So we just we do a standard 20% on almost all of, we do some experiments too. We do whole cluster and 50%. We do a bunch of experiments, but our standard baseline for our Pinot is 20% whole cluster. And that'll help with you in terms of balancing your acidity.
That's true. I was having some brainstorming with Adam. He came to drop off some grape samples for us. And we were wondering if we were going to be in that situation. I totally agree with Nick. You want to let it hang and naturally lose the acid in the grape. And then I was like, well, if we don't get there in a cold year, I was like, maybe this is the year we do whole cluster on our Santa Lucia Highlands Pinots. But they got there. They were in balance and we ended up not going in that direction in 23.
Really interesting. Well, let's turn it over to Allison. Allison, you give us your harvest experience. We have a couple more questions coming into the chat, but let's give Allison a chance to tell us about your 1,000-mile journey.
Totally. Totally. Yeah. So at Walt Wines, we make site-specific Pinot Noir from all along the Pacific coast. So Oregon, Anderson Valley, Sonoma Coast, Santa Lucia Highlands, Santa Rita Hills. So I have kind of a broad swath of context here. We make 2 Pinot Noirs from the Francione family. We've been making the Sierra Mar vineyard since 2012. And then we started making the beautiful Rosella's vineyard in 2016. And as we've said before, overall for this harvest, across the board, we've seen incredible quality. And I also want to mention that we make our wines up here in St. Helena at our facility. And I'm also the winemaker for a couple other brands who make a lot of cab here under the Hall label. So I did want to share just a couple of pictures of context of just who we are, where we are. We have a beautiful winemaking facility that we truck the grapes to. So this is our all-female winemaking team in our cellar with some great open top fermenters behind us that I love to use for Pinot Noir. So this is us during this harvest. Every day we taste through all the fermentation tanks together and then give the cellar instructions for how we want to pump those over or punch them down or what's ready to drain. So every day we're tasting over 100 tanks. We're a fairly large facility in that way. And so what was really interesting about this harvest in particular was 2 things. We've talked about how it was late, and I haven't heard a lot yet about how it was higher yielding. And so those 2 things together, especially for a facility like ours, made for a very compressed harvest. So what that means is we normally plan on harvesting our Pinot in September and then our Cab more in October. And this year, the Pinot was coming in at the same time as the Cab in October. And so we really had to think logistically about tank space and having enough room to put everything. And that was a real nail biter for a lot of wineries. So to give you guys an idea, we were about 15% over the tons we expected to receive for our entire Pinot program. And the last 2 weeks of October, we were bringing in over 150 tons per day for all our programs. That's a lot of fruit. That's like every day having 15 large elephants walk through your facility, getting all that processed, putting all that into tanks. So luckily, because the fruit was so healthy, the fermentations have been seamless. We got through that. We have an incredible team here at our winery. So I thought that was a pretty exciting part of this harvest. On October 30th, officially every single tank in the winery was full, but we got through it. And I would say this is also a picture of we have some really great sorting equipment specific for Pinot, very delicate destemming. And then this is also a picture of the grapes going onto a conveyor belt for optical sorting. So we have some really great tools in challenging vintages. I'm happy to say we didn't really need the optical sorter as much in 2023. There just wasn't a lot of raisin or compromised fruit to sort out. So that was just a beautiful thing. So context for how late we were. The Santa Lucia Highlands, I looked at the average of when we picked over the past 5 years, and we were 20 days behind that average. It was late. So we picked our Pinot Noir from the Santa Lucia Highlands almost mid-October. So that's pretty late. Anderson Valley was 25 days behind average. Sonoma Coast, 25 days behind average. Santa Rita Hills was a little more normal. It was only a week behind. And then what was funny was up in Oregon, where we make some Pinot, and then I've heard from friends in Washington, they had an extremely early harvest. So they were actually done before we had even started bringing in this hellish amount of fruit mid-October. They were pressed off. Everything was in barrels. So that was a very funny topsy-turvy experience for us this harvest.
Should I go ahead?
Go ahead.
Okay,
Yes.
I'll go ahead. It's interesting because I mean, I'm going to sort of say a similar thing to what everybody else has said, but, you know, I've been making wine in this area since 2004 before it was Wrath, it was San Saba Vineyards. And I remember in 2004 when I started in the first maybe 8-10 years of my career there, you know, we sort of picked Pinot in the middle of September. We picked Sauv Blanc, which was our first pick, Labor Day-ish. So the 6th or 7th of maybe the 5th of September. And then it kept creeping further toward August, I felt. I actually feel like the 2021s that you guys are going to now start seeing in the market are more like when I first started. Like we thought it was 2 weeks late because everything sort of got moved up closer to the early part of September. To me, now it's sort of moving back. Now, I didn't really want it to move back this far. That's a little much, 4 to 5 weeks, 4 weeks late, essentially. But I feel like 2021 was 2 weeks late, quote unquote, maybe a week and a half late. And then, which I think 2021 is an amazing vintage. I'm really, really happy with the way those wines turned out. And then 2023, yeah, we're going to have some dancing around with the acidity in these wines, but I don't think it's anything anybody on this panel can't handle. You know, the one thing I love about our job, and I think about any job really, is that at some point your job should become intuition. It shouldn't be, you know, you're constantly looking at a piece of paper trying to figure out something. You know, you've worked with the fruit long enough, you understand these vineyards long enough. I'll be honest though, I did say this year I thought I'd seen everything. You think you've seen everything, and then 2023 comes along where you're picking Pinot. Our first pick of Pinot, I wrote it down, was the 3rd, and that was our early pick of Pinot. You see, this is a picture of our vineyard. These are all of our bins out. And then we even had harvest bins that we were fermenting in the winery because we ran out of fermentation bins essentially. But yeah, the other thing that does when you have everything in the barn all at once is, you know, and you only have 2 pumps, I used to pump over all of my bins. I typically pump over all the bins. Well, we just had to go to punch downs. But by the time we'd start pump overs in the morning, we'd have to, after lunch, turn around and start evening pump overs. So basically all the outside bins we only pumped over inside, and all the outside small bins went to punch downs. And we bought 2 new punch down devices, and we had 5 guys going at once. So it's a good workout, and that way you don't have to be there till midnight doing pump overs. But yeah, the fruit looked great. I have no complaints about the fruit. I think the fruit quality was amazing. And as I mentioned before, you know, there are things you can do. You know, whole cluster will help acid. But I thought everything seemed pretty even. You know, we're always looking for balance. And sort of what Nick was talking about is in what you guys were talking about, you know, you sort of taste a great vintage before it goes in bottle, and what you taste is that balance. You taste the acid. It's always should be a little bit more acidic, right? Because you don't want it to go fall flat in the bottle. But we all at this point have the intuition where we know what that tastes like before it goes in bottle, and you can sort of see the arc of that wine in 6, 8, 10 months when you're going to go release it. You know, there's always things that need to shake out a little bit, but I think for the most part, you see the whole holistic part of the particular wines when they're really true gems. But as I mentioned, we're really lucky. We don't have a lot of pressure down here where we get grapes from. So we typically get really great fruit in, and it's easy to make great wine when you have grapefruit product. But the only other thing I always want to mention, because I'm a tomato grower, and something that I think a lot of people who have gardens in the group here can relate to is you can understand our season if you look at your tomato or your garden. My same thing, like we had rain into June. I'm in the Santa Cruz Mountains. I just ripped out healthy tomato plants with tomatoes on them. And the only reason why I had to rip them out is because I'm in a mountain valley and once it gets below 35, which it has been at night, all the tomatoes freeze and they get cardboardy, and I give them to the chickens and they can eat them. But if you look at your garden is sort of an amplification of what we saw in the vineyard, which is long growing season, healthy plants, healthy tomato plants into November. Like that's just unheard of, right? So think about it that way in terms of what you saw in your garden and what we see out in the vineyard. And the other thing that bums me out when the harvest is short is I always make lunch for the guys, but we missed hot dog day. It's like I got to the end of harvest and we had our big fancy Persian meal because my husband's Iranian, so we always have a big Persian meal. And I realized we never had hot dogs. Maybe next week we'll have hot dogs before we go on holiday.
Sabrina, I had another question for you. You make wine from a lot of different vineyards and
Yeah.
at different elevations. I'm curious about that. If you saw any differences on elevation, because of this strange season. And then also I wanted all of you guys to comment a little bit about Syrah, right? Always the last to come in. Everybody, we just saw this great report on the SLH from Venice Media and Antonio Galloni, who was kind of raving about the SLH Syrahs. So Nick and Sabrina, maybe you can comment on those two things.
Well, it was always a big joke when I started working with Garrett Buchanughen that he is a high elevation vineyard, and I would pick Sauv Blanc and 3 days later he'd want to pick Pinot. So I would always say to him, no, it's going to be crazy, too much acid. And the first time I worked with him, this was years ago, he said, trust me, Sabrina, it'll reconcile out. And it did. And so I typically pick Buchanughen vineyard with my early with Sauv Blanc. And this year I have my notes. We picked Tendre on the 9th of October, KW and Buchanughen on the 11th, and McIntyre on the 18th. And I think the only reason why we picked McIntyre on the 18th is because I didn't have any room to put it. Once we get full, I'm full, and it typically is the higher acid vineyard, and I wind up picking it a little bit later. But yeah, everything sort of came crunched up together in a tighter time zone, and stuff wasn't exactly in the order. And then I think at some point when you realize that everything's going to sort of come in tight, it just becomes a logistics game, essentially. Like, where can you put what size lot? The one reason why I wanted you going to show the picture of the tractor night picking, quote unquote, in the vineyard is because I'd have my night crew come in. And the one thing that happened, because everything got so condensed, is our vineyard management team, they just had to run crews all the time. And so they would say, we're going to come pick at night. And then they'd show up at 4 o'clock. I'm like, what are you guys doing here? And if you look at that photo, you'll see a tractor in the vineyard with the lights on, and it's not quite dark yet because they would just have to. They had to go from us to somebody else. And then we would just leave a guy there with the forklift, and they would stick everything in the barrel room, in the cold room. So yeah, do you see it's not really dark yet, but that's a tractor in the vineyard with its lights on. And it had been already out there for about an hour. And it's just because they didn't, at some point they have to schedule guys, and it just becomes tight, and you just have to be a little bit more forgiving of that kind of situation. But
tell us a little bit about Syrah.
So I love Syrah. I love cool climate Syrah. I'm so glad this year is going to be, I think, an amazing year. I think when you have cooler climate Syrah, you get all of those sort of exotic components in it. To me, it's sort of like curry spice, the coriander, the caraway, the cumin, those sort of beautiful spices put together. And I've always tried to sort of pick on the leaner side, but sometimes you get backed up in the winery and you're like, oh crap, Syrah. But this year, I think it's going to be amazing. It was easy to pick. I think we waited. I mean, the only reason why I waited was I wanted it to get to 24 bricks and that, but the acids were all good. And I'm really excited about 2023 Syrah. I think it'll be great.
What about you, Nick?
On the Syrah, given how late this year was, there was more anxiety about Syrah and whether it would truly get there or not. We have a small patch of Grenache as well, and same kind of deal. It limps to get to 25 bricks if we can get it there. But Syrah sometimes acts differently from anything else, and it seemed almost kind of normal in comparison to previous years. The chemistry, grape chemistry was pretty normal and fine. So it moved along at the tail end of its ripening quicker than we had expected. But yeah, like Sabrine was mentioning, always some beautiful spice to cool climate Syrah, a lot of freshness. You get, certainly fruit forward when it comes to the SLH, and that's no different for Syrah.
Gwen, can I tell a Syrah story real quick? It goes back to 2002 vintage, and Nick mentioned that vintage earlier, which was one of the latest vintages, not picking till November. And I remember going in and doing punch downs, and it was fascinating, that late cool Syrah. It was very different. It reminded me of Cornas. It had more kind of earthy character, gamey, kind of funky, but beautifully aromatic. Like Nick mentioned, great colors. I think we picked in 2002, like November 8th or 10th. I mean, very late in 23-8, if I remember. I mean, wasn't incredibly ripe. It was just an incredible wine, a remarkable wine, but I would pour it for people, and it wasn't what they expected for California Syrah. Sometimes they wanted big fruit forward, rich, and this was very different. It was really fascinating. And I one time did this wine dinner, and I was pouring the wine for people, and it was a group of 60 people, and you saw half the people were like, oh my gosh, this is incredible, and half the people were like, oh, what, this is different, this is really odd. And so I did the show of hands, and it was like half the people loved it and half the people hated it. And there was nobody in the middle. It was all like one or the other. It had just so much character. And I ended up at the end of the dinner sitting down at a table with 3 couples. All of them were older, in their 70s, and one couple in their 80s. And I asked what they thought of it. And it was like, hated it, loved it, hated it, loved it, hated it. And the oldest lady at the table, she was like, this wine reminded me of college. And I'm like, well, I've heard a lot of interesting things about this wine, but I haven't heard it reminded you of college. What do you mean? And she's like, well, in college, I spent a summer in Paris, and it was a hot summer. And I dated this young French boy, and he smelled awful. And this wine smells a lot like he did. And I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry, ma'am. And she's like, oh, no, don't apologize. All we did all summer was screw, and it was fantastic. And this wine is like that. It smells awful, but it's absolutely incredible. And her husband of like 50 years is sitting next to her, and he was like, oh my God. And so I think these later years can be just fascinating to see what happens on a late grape type like that.
I wanted to mention, Angus, thank you for your comment here. Thanks for joining, a good friend of ours from over on the coast. Emmanuel Kamiji, who's a somm and also makes wine from the SLH, or at least used to, he is a fan of Syrah. And you mentioned in your comment, Angus, about we're seeing less Syrah but more Gamay. I have been tasting some of these beautiful Gamays. I will note there is still more acreage of Syrah than Gamay, but what do you guys think about this Gamay? We've got a beautiful one from Lucy, we've got Carcioli, we've got a couple other folks making some cool Gamays. What do you think?
We made one last year, mostly out of fun and intrigue, and I think it came out pretty well. It's a very good varietal, but I don't know that it has the potential to get high marks or high aspirations like Pinot does. It doesn't really quite have the cellar ability, but it is a very approachable, drinkable, ready now, good for the table type of wine. So we have a great climate for growing grapes. Gamay certainly appears to do well here. And it's also a very high acid type of varietal. So that can also lend well in our neck of the woods. My experience is pretty limited though, just to that one vintage. But I don't know if the economics in today's world are really going to pan out too well for a whole lot of people grafting over to Gamay.
I loved it, Nick. It was a great wine.
I'm gonna say something no winemaker should ever say, but I'm gonna say it. I don't like Gamay Rouge. It's the one varietal. I've tasted it through Beaujolais. I've tasted it in people's garages in Beaujolais. There's something about it that's it tastes bubblegummy and geranium to me, and I'll make it for somebody else, but they have to taste it and tell me if they like it.
Okay, one more question. That's a great one from Carl. How do you decide how much and how long to use new oak? This is a great question. How do you make these decisions when you have to buy your barrels, months before you even have a vintage? How does that look for you guys?
I think it's mostly winery driven. It's what is your style preference? What is it that you're really shooting for as far as the amount of new oak that you want to use? Of course, there's different oaks. There's American oak, Hungarian oak. There's a bunch of different ways that you can go with that for again, style. So it really just depends. And a lot of it is trial and error. There's no perfect way of knowing how something is going to pan out until you've really done something and learned from it. I really do think that a lot of winemaking is trial and error. And really just growing and iterating on it. Certainly you can shoot for something and you can drive a style, but there's no perfect foresight for how something's going to adapt. But back to the question, it really just depends on the winery and the varietal as well. Something like Syrah doesn't do well with a whole heck of a lot of new oak. We only use 10 to 20% of new oak on Syrah. For Pinot, it can hold on really, really well. You see people use less, maybe 15, 20%, sometimes none at all. You can use 100% new oak though on Pinot Noir or Cabernet. So the varietal can dictate quite a bit of that and how intense the marriage of wine and the oak goes.
To add to that, the vintage can too. We react as we're tasting the fermentation in tank. And if it's a little lighter, we'll go a little lighter on the oak so it doesn't overwhelm the wine. But if it seems like a really robust wine, we might add some more new oak to that percentage that year.
What about using different forests or different grains? Does that affect when you're tasting from your ferments and adjust? I mean, if you're buying from France, you probably don't have much wiggle room as far as those barrels coming to you. But does that affect what you're matching the wine with as far as the oak goes?
Yeah, some are more impactful than others. So I have when I buy my oak the year before, I have a certain percentage in mind for each kind of type of grain or toast level that will be stronger or lighter touch. And so that's another thing that I'll be thinking about when I'm filling barrels. Is if I want to use something impactful or not. And I usually have a little bit left over, so there's some wiggle room. So what I don't use in 2023, I'll use in 2024.
Yeah, and I was just going to add on too, I think site's really important. I just finished my 23rd vintage. It's all been Chard and Pinot, but from all different places in California. And I think site plays a big role in how your wines react in barrel as well. So I've definitely changed my coopers over the years as I've switched locations, as well as when I go down to barrel. Some wines really do well fermenting in barrel and they can handle that longer time and integrate really well, where some of them will gobble up all of that oak and you want to wait a little longer and maybe not put them down to barrel until you start to go through ML. So Sabrine talked about intuition. I call it winemaking spidey sense, but it's really about, knowing the land, knowing the fruit, and how those ferments are going to be carried out, so that you can pick the right barrels and toast levels and forests, as well as the timing of when you go down to barrel.
Adam, any comments?
It is hard because we have to argue the barrels, order the barrels so far ahead of time, and it is a challenge. And so that's always a real issue, is trying to figure that out. I do think that our ability to adjust the oak is somewhat limited. I'm now making some wine in France, and they can get barrels immediately and much quicker. We have less of that, but I do think there are questions and things you can do. How quickly do you put the wine into barrel? Do you separate your press fractions out? And so some of those, maybe if you press immediately upon the conclusion of fermentation, particularly when you use a lot of whole cluster, like I do, or Sabrine, you do some, you'll notice that some of those ladder press sections will have a little bit of residual sugar in them, and then they will finish fermenting in the barrel. And so do you put that in new oak to that fermentation in the barrels extracts more of that new oak flavor, or it extracts less of it? So there are still a lot of things that we can do. I think a year like this, with the very, very good levels of natural acidity, seems to me like in the Pinot world, which is what I really specialize in, the Pinot world is going to stand up to oak pretty well and not really show it exceptionally. It's not going to stand out in the wine.
Very interesting. Well, I think that this has been a wonderful update. It's really another beautiful, beautiful conversation, and great to have such a tremendous year like 2023. It's around the corner. We're going to start seeing action on our 2024 season. I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Adam, Nick, Sabrine, Allison, Cami. Thank you all so much for being here. Really happy to have you. We've taken up a good hour of all of you who've joined us, and we appreciate that. Thank you for the comments in the chat. Well, we will record this video and post it and share it. So please feel free to let us know if there's something else you'd like to see next. And we'll be back next year with some more updates on the growing season for 2024. Thank you again, everybody. Thank you for joining us.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Randy.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, guys.
Excellent.